This is my very first time to be in Russia and here in Moscow. I'm very excited not only to speak about hopefully interesting things in Europe and in some big cities in Europe, but also get in contact with you in the audience and to really get into a dialogue on these topics we are talking about here. The topic is urban policy and economic development in the European Union, as Elena has introduced a bit. I would like first a bit to introduce my lecture as an overview. The content will be, in the first part, I will be talking about urban development policy in the EU. You see in the design of my presentation, it's a bit like an umbrella, blue umbrella. On the left hand, you see the European symbol, the stars in a circle. And I would like to express with this that I'm really a convinced European. This evening, I'm not talking on behalf of the city of Berlin. The city of Berlin, the government there, the Senate, is my current employer. And I'm working there for the last 10 years. But this event is very different, so I'm talking to you tonight as independent consultant because urban development issues are not really in the core of my employment in Berlin right now. So first part will be about urban development policy in the EU with a special focus on economic development as key policy field. The second part will be more illustrative, will be more about examples. I will show examples of outstanding urban development in Hamburg, my hometown, in London, in Paris, and in Barcelona. You see the biggest the biggest member states of the European Union. And finally, I will try to conclude and to come back to the key question of this evening, which is about policy. Who makes policy? Who's responsible? Which level is responsible? When Strelka invited me to do this lecture tonight here, the key questions, one of the key questions was, is it a national level? Is it a national urban policy? Do you have a national urban policy in Germany and in Europe? Do you have a national policy on economic development? Yeah, that was the first question. And then we got, in the preparation of this lecture, we got into a dialogue and discussed about these questions. And at the end, and this is really the key question of this evening, is to see who is responsible at which level for what. Is it the national level, the national government? Is it more the local level, the cities themselves, or even lower, the district, the neighborhoods, or vice versa? Is it, in my case, I'm speaking under the umbrella of the European Union, is it more the European Union who is also responsible for urban development and economic development? In other words, is it bottom up, from the bottom up, or is it top down? And this is the key question of the evening. So my personal background, as mentioned, I'm from Hamburg, it's my beloved hometown. Hamburg is located in the north of Germany. For those perhaps who have been to Germany, it's 100 kilometers east of the North Sea with 1.8 million inhabitants, second largest city in Germany, third largest port of the European Union, with the biggest employer, the Airbus Industries. You know, of course, all of you will know Airbus, which employs 16,000 people in Hamburg. I studied political science, sociology, communication science, German language, and urban development. And I'm looking back to a career of more than 28 years now. I've been working as journalist in communication as well as consultant and policy officer, which I'm doing, what I'm doing now for a long time. Within multiple policy areas such as urban development, housing, employment, education, economic development, and smart city, including many transnational activities, most of them across Europe, sometimes a bit further, but mostly concentrated on the European Union. Currently, I've mentioned I'm employed in Berlin at the Senate, and I'm dealing with issues like startup support and further training. Okay, coming to the first part of the lecture, urban development policy in the EU. Thesis, key thesis, the main responsibility for cities have the cities themselves. In the European Union, the European level as well as the national and the regional governments play also important roles in terms of strategy and funding, and what is very important as well, mutual learning. Some of you might know the EU, the legal basis of the European Union is currently the Lisbon Treaty, 10 years ago now. But in the Lisbon Treaty, there is no explicit mandate for urban policy. There's only a small slot where it is said that the European Union is responsible for the environment in the cities, for the environment in town and city planning. This is the only small slot. But coming to the key thesis, the cities themselves are most important, as well as the national governments are responsible for urban development in the EU. The overall strategy for the EU in the current financial period between 2014 and 20 is called Europe 2020, including regional and urban development as one of the key policies, with an increasing importance of cities, as more than 70% of people live in cities in Europe. Europe, the European Union, is an urbanized continent, more urbanized than most of other continents around the globe. The overall strategy of the EU is called Europe 2020, including urban development. Within Europe 2020, we have a so-called urban agenda, which has been launched 3 years ago in 2016, based on more than 20 years' experience of EU urban policy, including a so-called community initiative urban, in which I've been involved, and the Leipzig Charter on Sustainable European Cities from 2007, with a key idea of cross-sectoral, which is integrated urban development. I will talk about this later because this is one of the key topics of the lecture. What is integrated urban development? For those of you who have been visiting the lecture last week on Friday, there was also the topic of integrated urban development from a more global perspective of the United Nations and the We Are Habitat program. I will talk about this conception more within the European Union. This graph here shows, tries to illustrate a bit the key ideas of the urban agenda. What you can see here in the middle field, in this field, is may illustrate the importance of cities for the European Union. More than 70% of people, of the inhabitants of Europe are living in cities. More than 70% of the legislation is implemented in cities, yeah, of the European legislation. We have more than 70% of the jobs in the European Union is located in cities. And finally, 85% of the GDP, of the economic product of the European Union, is produced in cities. You can simply say cities are the most important entity of the European Union. So, and the idea of the urban agenda is to bring all the topics which are relevant for cities to one table, to one policy approach. This is what we call integrated urban development, all under one umbrella. Because we have all learned that it's better to coordinate different policy areas like employment policy, economic development, environmental issues, educational issues, social issues, issues of social integration, to coordinate this under one umbrella, which we call the integrated urban development. This is the key idea of the urban agenda. Yeah? You have similar on the global level of the UN, perhaps, I don't know where they've mentioned it, but you have also an urban agenda of the United Nations meanwhile. But as far as I remember, the European Union was the first to talk about an urban agenda, and then came the UN and developed a similar idea of integrated urban development called urban agenda. Okay, quickly, a journey through the most important strategies of the European Union in terms of urban development and economic development. The strategy Europe 2020, which is the overall strategy of the European Union, is a strategy for growth and jobs, economic targets. Smart, sustainable and inclusive growth as an economic target is most important. It's in the center of the European development. Yeah? This has been decided around 10 years ago in Brussels and in the European Union institutions. But combined with ambitious environmental and social targets. This is important. Yeah? We have under the Europe 2020 strategy quantified objectives translated into national and as well as regional targets. Most important is the target of 75% of people aged between 20 and 64 to be in work. Work, of course, employment is most important. 3% of the gross domestic product should be invested in research and development, because this is also very important in terms of economic development. And then we have, as I've mentioned, also social and environmental targets, 20% less greenhouse gas emissions, 20% of energy from renewables, and 20% increase in energy efficiencies. Just to give you a figure from Germany, we have meanwhile a share in the German energy sector of more than 40% of electricity being produced by renewables, yeah, by wind and solar power production. And this is, in this case, Germany is quite good performing in terms of the environmental targets. Other targets are less than 10% early school leavers, quite obvious, I think, and 40% within higher education. And poverty, of course, is also still a problem in the European Union. And there's a target at least 20 million people less being affected or at risk of poverty within 10 years under this umbrella of the Europe 2020 strategy. Under this overall strategy, we have the EU regional and cohesion policy. And this is my job, more or less. I'm working for nearly a quarter of a century, meanwhile, 25 years within those strategies of EU regional and cohesion policies. The background for this is a considerable economic and social contrast within the EU, particularly post-24, when 12 countries, most of them formerly of the so-called Eastern Bloc from the former Soviet Union empire, joined the European Community in 2004. Targets of the EU regional and cohesion policy are economic growth, again, of course, reduction of unemployment and poverty in less developed regions, and a budget contribution to the Europe 2020 strategy. The tools are coordinated policies, structural and investment funds. The Cohesion Fund, the Regional Development Fund, and the Social Fund are the most important European funds. Me personally, I'm most experienced with the European Social Fund, but as well with the Regional Development Fund. The Regional Development Fund is most responsible for urban development in the EU. The budget of the EU regional policy in the current financial period is 451 billion euros, which represents around half of the EU budget. Yeah? The member states of the European Union give money to the European level, and our regional policy represents half of the budget, but it's only 0.5% of the gross national income, GNI. Yes, to give you a picture of the importance of the European level, it's not much money, it's very, very few money, which goes to the European Union level. This map shows Europe, as you certainly will recognize. The more and the less developed region, the poorer and the richer countries. There's no surprise that the more developed countries are more in the heart of Europe. It is Germany, it is England, it is France, it's the north of Spain. It's other smaller countries like Austria and of course the Scandinavian countries. These are the dark blue fields here. Then you have the red ones. These are the less developed countries, more in the east of the European Union, and in other regions at the fringes of the European Union, in Portugal, in Italy, and in Greece. And then you have so-called transition regions. These are regions in between the wealthier and the poorer, which you have here in this on this map. In a light blue color. ERD and ESF. ERDF is the European Development Fund and ESF is the European Social Fund. I know it's horrible for people who are not familiar with the European policy to hear so many abbreviations, but this is simply a part of the game. The ERDF, the European Regional Development Fund, just to give you an example of the programs in Berlin where I work, and the current funding period is 635 million euros coming from the European Union, and the same amount of money is coming from the regional level, from Berlin. We call this principle co-funding. The targets of this program, of the ERDF program, are innovation, economic development, reduction of CO2 emissions, sustainable and integrated urban development. The latter is equipped with 90% of the budget of the ERDF program. Then the European Social Fund program, the ESF program, which is far smaller with 250 million euros from the European Union and 250 million from the regional level. This fund is about sustainable development, sustainable employment, of course, and job creation. It's about social inclusion, education, and lifelong learning. All around the labor market, all around the educational system is the European Social Fund. Both operational programs, OP is operational programs, as well as the German national operational ESF program, are contributing explicitly to economic development and partly also to urban development. The ERDF fund is more contributing directly to urban development. The social fund is less explicitly contributing to urban development. My own programs, just to give you these examples, ESF funding for training and for startups in Berlin. These are two instruments of 22 which we have currently in Berlin. The one program is about innovative further training in companies with a budget of 5.8 million euros from the European Union, the same amount from the land of Berlin. Which is for training, innovative training for some 1,500 employees in companies in Berlin. The second program, which is far bigger, is a so-called Berlin Startup Scholarship with a budget of 20 million ESF and 20 million from the regional level for some 1,300 founders who want to create tech startups, For those of you who are a bit familiar with the economic development programs, it's not only in Europe, not only in Germany, that startup development, the support of startups and tech startups, IT, digital technologies and so forth and so on, is more and more important part of the economic development activities. Both instruments, both of the ESF, these instruments contribute to economic development and job creation. In particular, the startup funding is increasingly targeted at smart city solutions, e.g. in the mobility sector and to urban development. This is more or less part of my contribution when I further developed this program during the last years. Economic development policy in Germany, this addresses more the questions from the beginning, which I've mentioned when Strelka asked me here to do this lecture. What is the national policy in Germany in terms of economic development? Perhaps you know a bit the structure in Germany. We have in Germany, we're a federal country. We have, of course, the national level, and we have the level of the so-called Bundesländer. And so we are a federal system with 16 Länder in the national level. And, of course, the local levels, which are represented by districts and cities. The biggest program for economic development in Germany is the joint task of the federal government, the national level, and the Länder, the regional level, for the improvement of the regional economic structure, GRW, abbreviated funding of economy-related infrastructure and innovation of enterprises, including startups, with a budget of 130 million per year. Most important economic development programs for less developed regions are as the EU structural funds, which I have briefly described, and this joint task for the federal government and the Länder in Germany. And both are contributing to the development more or less in the less developed regions in Germany, which is the east of Germany. We still call them Neue Länder, yeah, which are the regions of the former GDR, and Berlin. This shows a bit the situation in Germany in terms of funding. Again, a map of more and less developed regions in Germany. The eastern part, the blue part of Germany, is the less developed part, the former GDR. Still, we have 30 years after reunification. 30 years after reunification, we have still big differences within Germany between the west and the east. Yeah? And so we need more funding for economic development in the east of Germany. You can see directly at the border to Poland, on the right side of the picture, we have the weakest economy in Germany, where most of the money, most of funding goes to. Coming back to the issue of urban development, integrated development. The reason why we do it, I have already described it a bit, I would like to deepen it a bit. Diverse challenges such as, now I'm talking about problems, diverse challenges such as derelict neighborhoods, weak local economy, unemployment, poverty, etc. require diverse and well-coordinated policy actions. Well-coordinated is important because sectoral policies have proven not to be so successful as well-coordinated policy. The idea of the conception of integrated urban development is to integrate, as I've said, all policy fields relevant for urban development within one overall strategic approach, increasingly called at neighborhood level or district level, neighborhood management. Originally, this term comes, of course, from England, from the UK, because it's the country of the English language. And they have called it neighborhood management. We call it in German, for instance, Nachbarschaft, Quartiersmanagement. Complicated German term. Involved policy in this context are economic development again, as one of the most important contributions, employment policy, education, social inclusion, mobility issues, housing issues, urban renewal, energy transition, environmental protection, etc. All under one roof of one strategy. Some more features of integrated urban development: cooperation across different policy areas and departments of a municipality, cooperation between all levels of government and local players. This leads again to the questions of bottom-up or top-down. Who is responsible? Most important responsible are the cities themselves, but the national level as well as the EU level are contributing. We call this multi-level governance. This is a very trendy, you can say trendy term in European language or specific language, but this is really something what is realized in practice of funding all levels, from the European, the national, the regional and the local level, are cooperating together in terms of economic development as well as in terms of urban development. One important aspect of urban development is economic regeneration. We call those programs regional and national programs dedicated to regenerate deprived urban neighborhoods. It's again a focus on the less developed, and the problem areas, if you like, in an integrated way, were developed in several EU member states since the late 1990s. For instance, in Germany, in Berlin and Hamburg, the biggest cities, in the UK, in London, in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, second biggest city, in Denmark, in Copenhagen, the capital city again, in Sweden, in Malmö, also a big city in the south, and in Austria, again, in the capital, in Vienna. You see, the background for these economic regeneration programs is the division of the cities, yeah? If you look at all these names, the cities and the countries, these are all wealthy countries and wealthy cities, most developed in Europe and even in the world scale, very, very far developed. But still, there are big contrasts within the cities. So there was recognized during the 90s the need to do something against deprivation in certain districts and neighborhoods of the wealthy cities. And this is what we call economic regeneration or regeneration programs. Economic regeneration and job creation has always been among the key policy actions in those programs, particularly within the EU community urban, which is about integrated urban development, funded from the European Union level by the Regional Development Fund, the ERDF. As follow-up of this urban initiative, which took place some 20 years ago, meanwhile, emerged the program called UrbAct, which is a program about learning of cities within networks on strategies of integrated urban development. You can imagine city networks of cities which are having exchange on certain strategies, maybe around mobility, but not only mobility, it's also about the energy sector, it's also about the environmental aspects of mobility, it's also about the infrastructural implications around mobility. Yeah? Just to give you one example, and if you have maybe 5 or 6 cities who are interested in such an issue, they gather and they have a network, a formal network, and have exchange. And this is what is happening under the umbrella of this UrbAct program. Me personally, I'm involved as an expert in UrbAct. Again, economic development policy is one of the most important topics also within UrbAct. If we go further, I've started with the problem areas, with the poor areas, and if we now go further to the more, what the English people describe as opportunity areas, opportunity boroughs, opportunity districts, then we come to the conception of innovation districts. This is a more modern term, if you like, of integrated urban development. And this is meanwhile also a part of the urban agenda of the EU. At city level, for an entire big city, we don't have so many examples, at least in Germany, where we can talk about integrated urban development, including innovation district. We have a strategy in Frankfurt, in Leipzig, in Potsdam, but you see, these are not the biggest cities. We don't have such strategies in the biggest cities like Hamburg, Berlin, or Munich. But we have far more activities in terms of innovation districts and integrated development at district level, particularly within the context of brownfield regeneration, former industrial areas, rundown areas which fell down due to structural change, the renewal of working class areas, housing areas, residential areas, and waterfront development, including comprehensive economic development activities, partly called what I've innovation districts. Within this conception of innovation districts, as I've also already mentioned, are startups and smart cities as relatively new conceptions of economic development support. This has become more or less during the last 15 years one of the most successful strategies of economic development, particularly in the large cities. Yeah? This is mainly due to the universities and the research sectors, because most of the innovation, the technical innovation and other aspects comes from science from the universities, which are located in big cities. At the same time, the policy approach of smart cities has been developed, initially focused mainly on digital tech solutions, but meanwhile urban mobility by car sharing, for instance, e-vehicles and autonomous driving. But most recently, during the last maybe 5 years, a broader conception of smart cities, including social and environmental aspects, is emerging, partly linked with the development of innovation districts. This picture might give you an impression of what we, or a symbol of what we understand as a smart city. A smart city is based on technological solutions, and as we all know, technological solutions depend more or less on IT and digital devices. Yeah? And if you connect different topics of cities via IT and digital solutions, then you can show it like this picture shows it. Yeah, this is just a trial of an illustration of what we call the smart city, which we support by our programs. Okay, I would suggest to make a break here at this point of my presentation, because I believe there was a lot of input, a lot of perhaps more structural or theoretical input. So I would like to make a break right now and to ask you whether you have so far specific questions about the first part of my presentation. Yeah, Arthur will support me.
Да, друзья, ну, как вы услышали, Матиас предложил
as you heard, Matthias suggested splitting the talk into two bigger parts, and now we can switch to the Q&A session, and you can ask any questions you have, even in Russian, because we have a translation device. Please raise your hand, we will give you the mic.
Вперед.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask my question now. In your opinion, what are the projects already completed in smart city sphere in Berlin or in any other cities that you worked in? So, is any smart city concept implemented already?
Yeah, that's exactly what I will be talking about now in the second part, because yeah, that's a good question to build a bridge to the second part, because I will be talking now about several examples of what I think is really outstanding in terms of smart city, including smart city development. Yeah, you will you will see it in the second part of the presentation. Yeah.
Hello, I will ask my question in Russian too. My question is the following. It's evident that Germany is split into different regions, or Länder as you called it. Some are richer, some are poorer, but quite often the most interesting projects come from richer lands, right? And I wanted to ask you about Leipzig, because I saw that there is some innovative quarter there too, or innovative projects there too. So what are the conditions for your program? How do you select startups to be implemented in specific cities? As far as I know, there are these innovative different projects implemented in Hamburg, for example, but Hamburg is like the financial center of the country. Bavaria is a rich country, Hamburg also a rich city. But let's imagine that I'm a small, quite poor German town. How can I get the opportunity to implement my project? How can I develop basically as a small town? Thank you. Is it a kind of a tax system, redistribution of the taxes that come from the whole country? For example, if I don't have any industrial centers, where do I get the money for these projects from?
Thanks very much for this question. It's very interesting, but very heavy to answer, because this is one of the most important challenges, not only in Germany right now. Because you're completely right, we have most of the innovative developments is taking place in cities. Yeah. And I've mentioned one of the reasons for it. It is the universities, the research sectors, young people coming to the big cities, studying there, developing new things. For instance, our startups coming to Berlin, and so it's doing something very good for Berlin. But what about the rural areas and the small cities, if I understand this question right? And to be quite open, we don't have an answer. This is really a very honest answer, because if you look into German political discussions right now, this is one of the on the top level. We are a rich country compared with the rest of Europe and with the rest of the world, but we don't have really a conception for the rural areas. And to make it very short, in the eastern part of Germany, I showed it in my map. I will show it again. Yeah, here. Yeah, the former GDR area. And speaking in political terms, we have a right-wing development in Germany. We have a new party which is called the AfD, which is our right-wing party. But the AfD is not the only right-wing party in Europe. We have similar parties in the UK, in the United Kingdom, which wants to even leave the European Union, because the British government and the European level don't really have an answer to the city, how to help the rural areas, to the small cities. And the Brexit movement in the UK comes from the rural areas. And it comes not from London, it comes not from Birmingham, it comes not from Liverpool. It comes from the rural areas. And the same as in Germany, here in blue, in the east of Germany. So, to be quite honest, we have given a lot of money, a lot of funding to the poorer areas. But we're not really successful. That's right. I'm happy enough to work in the big cities, which is, you might say, an easy game. Yeah, that's true. I have a bit experience in working in Brandenburg. This is an area around Berlin, yeah, where I've been working some 15 years ago for a small city called Luckenwalde within this urban initiative, which I've mentioned in my presentation. I think we did perform in this urban program for this small city of Luckenwalde quite well. It's around 60 kilometers from Berlin, not so far away. But there is still far more unemployment and far more deprivation and poverty than we have in Berlin. So, yeah, that's the truth. I'm not really, I don't have really a good answer, an optimistic answer.
Good evening. My name is Evgenia. I'm from Full Tech Initiative. If you allow, I will build a bridge with the Friday talk when we were told that there can't be two identical cities, two same cities. So in the framework of these processes and procedures and funds that we were talking about, how do you manage to preserve inclusivity? Inclusion. I mean, how can you take into account all the characteristics of these different cities that are so different from each other in the framework of a bigger umbrella program?
I'm not quite sure whether I really understood the question because it's a very noisy, so because of acoustical. Did I understand right that you're asking for the challenge to really combat poverty and exclusion from society? Is that what you're questioning? Perhaps you can confirm or not.
No, not in this. I wanted to ask you, you have an umbrella strategy, you have standards, policies for all the cities in Germany, but how do you take into account the individual characteristics of different cities and towns, because they're also different?
Yeah, okay, now I've got it. Yeah, the answer is the city. The answer is a very good question. The answer is bottom up. If a national government, in our case from Berlin, would say, "Oh, we do this and that for the eastern part of Germany, for the rural areas," that's not good. The best knowledge of each territory is within the territory, within the city or a small town or a rural area. You have to listen to stakeholders who live and work there and bring them to the table of policy. Yeah? This is what we would describe in Germany and Europe as partnership approach. Partnership approach is one of the key principles of the European structural funds. And that really means that we don't act from the European or the national level and say, "Oh, this and that is the best for this small city, Luckenwalde, or this rural area in Italy or somewhere else." No, we ask the city, we ask the people, we ask the economy, we ask the enterprises, the companies, what are your needs? What do you need in your, or we ask the schools in terms of the educational system, what are your needs? How can we help? The questions at the beginning of every funding strategy, the question is the most important start of a strategy. It's the approach of bottom up.
Good evening. Good evening. In Russia, we have a big problem, a big challenge. Smaller towns don't know how to spend the money that they get from Moscow, for example. For example, we have a program of the comfort urban environment, and the cities can spend the money on whatever they want to, and they spend them on the wrong things. Do you have the same problem in Germany, and how can we deal with it, you think?
Yeah, I know this problem also in Germany or elsewhere also in Europe. A part of the answer is probably bureaucracy, public administration, and how public administration is successful in terms of this, what I've just described, to listen to people, what are really their needs. And then, of course, you have to have a strong management of public spending. You have to have controls, a monitoring system. You have to have evaluation. Yeah, these are all conditions for successful funding programs. And it's true that bigger cities tend to have more capacities and better capacities to cope with these challenges. And the answer is to strengthen the capacities of the smaller units, of the smaller cities, the public administration, yeah, the partnership institutions, the networks. Yeah, and a part of the money for the public programs is spent for this, what we call capacity building. To make it short, capacity building is the answer, at least from the perspective of the European structural funds. Yeah.
Matthias, I'd propose that we would proceed with the second part, and then we have a second portion session of questions. What do you think?
Perhaps one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Just, I know.
Hello. Germany has a distributed kind of structure. It has many huge cities covering the whole territory of the country. In contrast, Russia has a huge Moscow metropolis, and I'm Argentinian. Argentina has Buenos Aires, which is half of the city. I would like to know your personal opinion about which model of the country is preferable. What are the advantages of your preferred model, and what we can do as a country to kind of optimize our model?
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. Again, not quite sure whether I've really got your question. I would say, against the background of my long-term experience, the bottom-up approach is really important. Capacity building is really important. Integrated funding approaches are really important. Yeah, these are some advices I would give against the background of my experiences. But again, it depends on the territorial and the local context. So at the beginning of each strategy, you really have carefully to look at the territory and the communities, the people, the companies, the economy, the structures, and then have to develop a strategy, not top-down, not with an ideal idea of a strategy. It's, again, the idea, listen to the regions, listen to the stakeholders on the ground, and then develop the right strategy together with those people in partnerships. Yeah, that's it. Okay, I think then we can go on with the second part of my presentation, which perhaps also might give answers to some of the questions we have posed. Outstanding examples of integrated urban development. The background for this, as manufacturing industries, producing industries need water for production and transport, ports and rivers have always and everywhere been key to urban development. Economic, structural and technological change led to new land use strategies, brownfield regeneration, renewal of working class areas and waterfront development are most important starting points of urban renewal. Perhaps the most well-known example of such a development in the long-term perspective are the Docklands of London. So perhaps, may I pose you one question, because London is the most important city of the European Union. Whom of you have been to London? Who knows London personally from a visit? Please raise your hands. Do you know London? Yeah, at least a third or half of the audience have been to London. That's interesting. in London, London formerly had the biggest port of the world in the east of the city, yeah, where the Thames comes to the city from the sea, from the North Sea. And England has been, and London particularly, has been one of the engines of industrial revolution 200 years ago, around. And the deepest structural change in the history of the city was the change around the port industry in London. And that was the starting point for this conception here, with the example of the Docklands in the east of London, where, yeah, maybe for the first time, at least in Europe, if not in the world, the very, very comprehensive approach of integrated structural change in a port area happened. Yeah, beginning in the 70s of the last century, and it's still on the way now. And I will talk about this because this is an important example for some of those examples which I describe as outstanding examples of urban development, among others in London. When my beloved hometown, Hamburg, applied 4 years ago for the second time to act as host of the Olympic Games, the Summer Games, in 2024, I can say I got infected by the Olympic virus because I discovered a topic which I did not see before. It's the topic of a mega event like the Olympics. The Olympics are the biggest event on earth, the biggest party, the biggest meeting of people to have sport, to have cultural exchange, the biggest meeting of the world are the Olympics Games every 2 years in the winter and in the summer. Maybe also one of the most important cultural events of the world are the Olympic Games. So, and what you can see, if you look at the Olympic Games change cities. They have, in many cases, and in most cases in terms of the Summer Olympics, they have a huge impact on urban development because you have to build, in many cases, a lot of new infrastructure, not only the sports sites, also other infrastructure for the athletes and for the media. So when my hometown Hamburg applied for the Olympic Games 4 years ago, in 2015, I started research on this topic, the relation of Olympic Games and urban development. And we are talking about really one of the biggest developments in the cities which are caused by Olympic Games. I did a comparative study including online research, interviews and on-site visits in London, in my hometown Hamburg, in Barcelona and in Paris, and I will show you some of the features of these developments in terms of integrated urban development, in terms of bottom-up planning, in terms of local partnerships, all the aspects which I've mentioned during the first part of my lecture. The output of my work so far from the beginning were recommendations during the public debate in Hamburg in 2015. I participated in events, had many talks and exchange with politicians, with planners, with experts and so forth and so on. I wrote a newspaper article, I did presentations on this topic and my findings of this in Paris 2 years ago, last year in London. Lucky enough to do it in the Olympic Park itself, and I wrote a chapter last year and will hopefully soon be released by the Routledge publisher, which is one of the most well-known publisher for social science in Oxford, in England. The book will be released and should be released in this year, and I wrote a chapter for this book with a headline, Mega Events on Urban Development. This is London, this is the east of London, this is the Olympic Park called Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. This site has been, before the Olympics came to the east of London, one of the poorest parts of London. And London really suffers under deep contrast between the rich and the poor parts of the population, of the economy, and the territories. Yeah, and it was a Labour politician, Ken Livingstone, when he ruled in London. The Labour Party had the idea of bringing the Olympics to the east of London, to the most deprived areas of London, in order to regenerate a deprived part of the city. Yeah, that was the idea, and this has happened. The Olympics took place 2012, as you might remember, and left behind this, what you can see here, of course, the big Olympic stadium in the forefront, which has further developed after the Games in order to have a combination of a football stadium for West Ham United, meanwhile one of the first league clubs in England, and as well as a stadium for athletics. You can see, I'll show you the aquatics center where the swimming took place. This is a public pool, meanwhile. You can see here in the background more the press and media center, which is called Here East, and is meanwhile one of the most important innovation hubs of London, including many activities around startups, around technological developments, technological transfer from science to businesses, and so forth and so on. You can see here, this is the former Olympic Village, East Village called. There was the village for the athletes during the Games, and then has been further developed as flats for the population, of course, and housing. Residential issues are among the most pressing issues of all our big cities, and so there was really a need to do something for housing. Okay, it's located in the east of London. You see the river here. This is called the Lee River, which is part of a green belt in the east of London. I strongly recommend you, if you next time go to London, or for this reason go to London, please visit this Olympic park. It's one of the best pieces of urban development I've ever seen, really, not only in Europe. It's really a thing of integrated urban development, which brings together different aspects. I've tried to summarize the legacy, what they call the legacy of London 2012, by these informations and figures. Meanwhile, through the Olympics, there's excellent new transport infrastructure serving 5 boroughs. These are the districts in London, in East London, for 1.5 million residents, for trains, bicycle, pedestrians and cars, rapid trains, tubes, stations, bridges, paths, streets. Mobility, transport, and first of all, public transport, sustainable, environmental friendly transport is so important for cities, and they did it so well in London. Look at this example. The Queen Elizabeth Park has a size of 250 hectares. It's a fantastic new green land. It's free. You don't have to pay for it. There is no fence around it. Other parks in London have fences. It's totally open. Everybody can go there. You see playgrounds, cafes, restaurants. You see ArcelorMittal Orbit, which is a viewing tower. You see 5 new housing estates with 10,000 flats. You see 2 new business parks, with the biggest one, the initial one, the Westfield Shopping Centre with 10,000 new jobs. The Here East infrastructure, which I've mentioned, with 7,500 jobs, and the International Quarter, which is the biggest thing so far, a big new business center with around 25,000 jobs. Jobs are so important. They had such a big unemployment in the east of London. They still have an unemployment, but they have created a lot of new jobs through this development around the Olympic sites in the East. Okay, second example, my hometown, I come back. London 2012, and what I've just shown you, was the most important model for Hamburg when Hamburg tried to apply for the Olympic Games 4 years ago. This is an aerial view of Hamburg showing the city center. I show you the city center. This is the old city center of Hamburg. You see here the Elbe River, and you see here the harbor. This is the harbor. And this side here, this island of the harbor, has been the idea for an Olympic new district in the middle of an harbor. This was an idea. I was under fire when I saw this picture first time 5 years ago, because Olympic Games, Summer Games, took place very often in harbor city, in port cities around the globe. You can, if you have a look at the list of the Olympic Games around the globe, there are so many port cities. The last city is Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. But never there was the idea implemented to have the Olympics in the middle of a harbor, to use the Olympic Games in order to do regeneration of a part of the harbor where regeneration is really urgently needed. And that was the idea of the bid of Hamburg for the Olympic Games. This shows in another perspective the idea with the stadium, with accommodation for the athletes, and then later flats for people, with other sports facilities like the swimming pool or originally the aquatic center during the games. Here should have been a cruise terminal for cruise ships. Cruise ships are meanwhile very important for Hamburg, and so forth and so on, including social infrastructure, schools, kindergartens, retail sector, all included, integrated urban development in the middle of the city, in the middle of the harbor. This was the idea of the stadium. It's a nice picture. It's a rendering, of course, showing a stadium which should have been dismantled after the games and converted into a residential area. You see terraced housing here. And you see a rest of the stadium, which is, it's a sport facility for youngsters, for everybody who, for clubs, of course, who are doing athletics. There was the idea of the Olympic Stadium in Hamburg, not to have permanently a sustainable big stadium for 60,000 people, which is the minimum size of an Olympic stadium, which Hamburg does not need. But to convert it after the games to a residential, a very new idea. Never in the world has such a stadium been realized. It has cost a lot of money to develop such ideas. It's not done in 5 minutes, it's not done for nothing. It costs a lot of money. The application in Hamburg has costed around 10 million euros. Regeneration Games, this is the term invented before, not only in London, opposite to Hafen City. Hafen City, perhaps some of you who might have been to Hamburg have heard about it, is the largest inner city urban development project currently. It's more or less a business district from the beginning of the last decade. Including 45,000 new jobs, 7,000 flats, cultural facilities like the Elbphilharmonie, a fantastic new concert hall, very spectacular building also in terms of architecture, hotels, cruise terminal, retail, schools, to make it short, a piece of integrated urban development. A referendum, the politicians in Hamburg decided, the governing parties, which are the Social Democrats and the Green Party in Hamburg, decided to have a referendum. They said, oh, we will not spend so much taxpayers' money, which is always a huge investment. If you have Olympics, you have to do a huge investment for Olympics. We have to ask directly the people, the population. Yeah, that was especially this question was coming from the Green Party. And then it happened. And then they asked the people, and the people said no. 51.6% of the voters said no. And particularly those in the neighboring harbor and working class areas, in the poorer areas of Hamburg, people did not believe or still do not believe that Olympic Games bring any advantage to their lives. And that was the end of the application. And then Hamburg had to reject his bid for the Olympics. Okay, that's an overview of Hamburg. You see here the green is the Hafen city development. It's developed, this part is right now under construction. Oh, wait a minute. This is under construction. This is the area where the Olympic Island should have been now. As follow-up of the Olympic bid, half of the idea will be implemented. Half of the Grasbrook, this part is called Grasbrook, will be implemented as a part of integrated urban development, will be implemented as part of a Regeneration project with residential areas, with new businesses, with retail sector, with schools, with all which I have mentioned before. This is a rendering of this new idea. So you can say, at the end, the legacy of the bid is a good thing. Hamburg spent 10 million euros for the bid, for the planners and for the referendum. Cost a lot of money. And at the end, they have a new plan for this island. They don't have the Olympics, but they have a good plan for, yes, for an idea of urban development which is different to the Olympic idea, but hopefully, and I think, there are very good ideas to have this implemented in the future with an improved infrastructure for public transport, bicycles, pedestrians, rapid trains, tube stations, bridges, paths. You see the same vocabulary as in London. It's really the model from London. Not only from London, but London is outstanding. 3,000 new flats for 6,000 residents, a third of it social housing, subsidized housing for people who don't earn much money, parks, shops, business space, services, social infrastructure. 13,000 new jobs in companies and startups, including manufacturing. Lessons learned, Olympic Games as other major regeneration projects must leave behind beacons, I would say, beacons of integrated urban development, comprising a wide range of urban issues, interests and stakeholders. The key issues are high quality transport infrastructure, affordable housing, avoiding of gentrification. Gentrification means that people have to move away because the development becomes too expensive. This is a very simple definition, but perhaps we can discuss this. Jobs for all at all levels of skills. This is very important, not only for the the higher skills, but also for the entire population. Civil participation, really to involve people in the development, economic, social, environmental sustainability. The key question is not only in terms of Olympics, do all residents benefit from the legacy? All residents benefit from the legacy, including those of deprived areas. Does it really improve their living conditions? Yeah? The key value of such a development is a city for all, which is an economic as well as a social value. So time is running a bit, but I will show you quickly the last two examples after London and Hamburg. Some of you might know this. This is Barcelona. Barcelona is, from my point of view, I've seen many cities, nearly all big cities of Europe in my career, but Barcelona is really outstanding as an entire city. It is outstanding also due to the Olympic Games, which took place in Barcelona 1992. The Olympics were the starting point for the regeneration of the so-called Poblenou brownfield area, again a working class area, very close to the sea in this case, and poor working class district. In former times, cities who are located at the sea don't know the quality, knew the quality of their waterfront and the beaches as wealth, as something very good and attractive. It was vice versa. I have to remind it. The poorest people lived directly at the seaside. In the case of Barcelona, there wasn't a beach there. The beach came later. So, beginning with the Olympic Games in 1992, they developed this area alongside the beach and the waterfront, and made something really fantastic there. Since 2000, they called it the development of the 22 at Barcelona Innovation District, one of the largest urban regeneration projects in the EU, including 90,000 jobs. 50% of new companies are startups. You see, this is really new economy, really new economic activity. And flats for some 40,000 residents. New employment, housing and life workspaces, combined life workspaces through 5 knowledge-intense clusters: information and computer technology, ICT, media, biomedical, energy and design. These are the 4 economic clusters. They focused these 4 economic clusters in this area, in this formerly very, very poor area, and created a lot of new jobs and a lot of innovation. To be open, not for everybody. Of course, there are people living in Barcelona who don't find jobs in this area. This is true. But at the same time, the regeneration of this area is really a new quality for Barcelona, not only for the millions of tourists which meanwhile come to Barcelona due to this development, but for the entire population. I would say the Innovation District 22 at Barcelona is really very outstanding examples that you can really do something very good for the entire population by such a development, which started with the Olympic Games, with the idea of regeneration games. Last examples, looking into the future. This is a rendering of Paris, the north of Paris. We are 10 kilometers north of the center of Paris, in a district called Saint-Denis. You see in the middle of the picture here, you see a stadium. It's not very clear, it's a bit further in the background. This is the Stade de France. Stade de France has been built for the Football World Championships in France 20 years ago, in 1998. They built the stadium for 80,000 spectators, which is, since that time, of course, the national stadium for the national games of the France football national team, and as well a stadium for athletics. It's also a combined stadium like in London. It's one of the first in Europe combining football and athletics in one stadium of that size. The idea of the Olympics in Paris is more or less which will take place in 2024. These are the games for which Hamburg also applied, a competitive Hamburg, in other words. The idea in Paris is more or less to use the existing infrastructure, the existing sport sites and other infrastructure for the games. More than 80% of the infrastructure is already there in Paris and only has to be renewed. And then it will be supplemented by some new things like this, what you can see here. This will be the Olympic Village. Paris has especially ambitious targets in terms of climate change and environmental issues. You know that the World Climate Conference took place in 2014 in Paris and decided very ambitious targets connected with climate change. So that was really a push also for Paris itself, for this big city, to care for the environment and to change things in the housing sector, in the business sector, in the transport sector, in the mobility sector. And environmental aspects in Paris are really on the top of the agenda of urban development. And the idea of the Olympic Games in 5 years now is to show the world a model of an environmental friendly city, which you can see here for the athletes and for those who care for the athletes, and also for the media people. You must imagine when Olympic or the Summer Games take place somewhere, you have some 12,000 people who are the athletes. You have nearly the same who care for them, and you have nearly the same, again, 10,000 people and more on the media. So 30 to 40,000 people are coming for two times 2 weeks to a city and having this biggest party on earth. And what you can do and what is best to do to build an infrastructure which is really for use for the population and for the environment, of course. This is the idea of the Olympic Games of Paris. I should not go into the details of the application. I would like to come to an end of my lecture and would like to come back to the key questions of my lecture, which I've described as bottom-up versus top-down. This question, which I've tried to illustrate during the first and the second part of my lecture, is really one of the key questions of every strategy, of public strategy, of funding strategies. Not only in Europe, certainly in other continents, and certainly here in Russia, you will have similar discussions. The EU, in the case of the European Union, the EU, the member states, regions and cities are practicing in Europe an approach of shared responsibility, of multi-level governance and partnerships. For instance, the structural funds, in which I'm involved, in the European Social Fund right now, is being implemented as so-called shared management. Shared management means that a part of the management is done by the European Union and the European institution and the European Commission, and a part is done by us in Berlin in the public administration. Shared management, but more important from my point of view is that we in Berlin know how to best spend the money, but Brussels is involved. Most important, final sentence, most important are democratic cities, including political parliaments, governments, companies, social and economic partners, universities, NGOs and governmental organizations, citizens, etc., as they know best challenges as well as solutions. Okay, thanks for your attention.